Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
The irony of him getting flames tattooed on his neck hours before he was to die in flames.
Some people have called me a murderer.
It was a cold New England day, but the excitement in the air for us was just, it was unparalleled.
Looking at my friend Derek directly in the eye. That was it. Never saw him again.
96 bodies have been recovered and 7 so far have been identified. They say they may have to resort to medical records, dental records, and DNA with some of the other bodies.
How can there be 100 deaths and people only do 16 months?
They did their quick hit and they moved on with their politics. And we're all left to live with it.
Joe's not a religious guy. He doesn't pray. But he says I was talking to whoever would listen, that I had to get out so that I could be with my daughter.
These are the soundtracks of our lives.
It's the one thing in life that we all have in common. That's why all those people were there.
No indictments were sought against either the fire marshal, Dennis LaRocque, or the head of Jack Russell's Great White, that is Jack Russell.
Whenever you think it's not going to happen, it could happen.
And I'm sure right up to 11 o'clock that night, everybody on the guest list thought it was the luckiest day of their life.
They just came out, to see me sing.
It was the perfect storm that all came together in one split second.
Nobody deserves to die because they wanted to see a band.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 415. Available now in the US on Reels is The Guest List, a documentary that delves into the circumstances and ramifications of the 2003 station nightclub fire that left 100 people dead and 200 injured. A haunting exploration into how an unthinkable and unavoidable tragedy devastated a community. The Guest List is also a story of the human spirit rising above adversity. And joining me now is the director of The Guest List, Mr. David Bellino. David, I thank you so very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Matt. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. I remember, so I'm a fan of hard rock music, especially like music from the 80s. That's just my thing. And I remember vividly when the reports first came out about the station nightclub fire back in 2003. I mean, that even made news here in Australia, like it was on primetime news. And I was just really devastated watching it. I think to this day, I think it's like really kind of like a black mark in the history of that genre of music. And of course, everyone associated with it. What about yourself, David? Do you remember where you were? Do you remember what was happening in your life at the time when you found out about the fire at the station?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head for sure. I think a lot of people remember kind of where they were, especially if they were fans of the music. Just briefly, my background is in music video. I was a director. I've worked with a lot of those bands on Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood in the heyday of the 80s. And so I had a very close-knit attachment to that music as well. So I, like you, was also a fan, but I was also in the business. The answer to your question is I had moved back to Rhode Island in the United States, which was on the East Coast, about 3,000 miles away from Los Angeles, with a young 1-year-old and a 3-year-old little girl and my wife. And I just came back from a long stint in Los Angeles. I woke up one morning and to the horror, I was probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes from the station nightclub. That's how close I was in Rhode Island. And I certainly would have went to the show. I only did not go to the show because I didn't know about it. It wasn't promoted very well. But I just looked at the news and thought to myself a few things. One day, I think I just have to be the one to tell the story. I come from that era. I worked with these bands. I'm also from Rhode Island. So it was a very, very odd, I don't want to say coincidence, but it was sort of fate that I think brought me together. The other big thing was I had thought to myself, I could be one of those parents very easily, who didn't come home that night and had my young girls essentially be without a parent, as 65 other people were in that same position who lost a mother or father that night.
And that's just absolutely tragic. I mean, I remember that statistic. I've heard that in a previous interview, and it's devastating when you put it into that kind of context. It really is. The documentary itself, you spoke about the inspirations as to why you wanted to make it. How did the ball started to get rolling? When was it? When was that kind of circumstance came up when you knew it was the right time to get this story told again? Because I have a feeling that on your part, it would have been a case of maybe people have forgotten what's happened some 19 years ago, and it was up to you to kind of remind them and to make sure they knew there were people out there still hurting from this, and there was still justice to be done as well.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think it was around the 10th anniversary. And as you know, with a lot of tragedies, most all tragedies, they sort of fade in time, except for the people who are infected by them. But around the 10th anniversary, which was 2013, because the fire happened in February of 2003, you started to hear quite a few things going on. One of those was a book. The name of the book was Killer Show. And it was written by a person named John Barelick. John Barelick was one of the civil attorneys, very prominent attorney, who spent 7 years on the civil case of the Station nightclub. He also went on 3 years after that to write a book called Killer Show. That came out approximately at the 10th anniversary. So believe it or not, you say to yourself, well, okay, that's the 10th anniversary. That's 2013. And the documentary is just coming out in 2022. So it sounds like a long period of time. And I think some of it had to do with timing, just pure availability of me being able to take on a project like that. And then secondly, I just couldn't believe a story or a documentary of that caliber had not been done in the film documentary format. So I think it was a combination of those things. But the biggest issue was trust and access to tell such a powerful story. This was not getting in front of people with a microphone and, asking them questions. This was literally embedding yourself with all of these people on all sides and developing relationships over the years so that you can get the type of, emotions that we got out of the documentary. So if you add up all that time between the book and the relationships and just my time, you're talking 10 years after that. So you're talking almost 20 years. It is kind of incredible when you think about it.
It is indeed. What's also incredible is that what I really appreciated about the documentary is that not only is it very thorough in regards to the circumstances that happened, but it also talks about the personal stories of those who perished in the fire. Their families speak for them in your documentary. Their friends speak for them in your documentary. How difficult was it, though, to approach the survivors and the families of the victims of the fire? Was it, was it a lot of what you were saying before, laying down the groundwork and to show that you are legit, you are of the community, and you're not going to take advantage of it? Because I'd imagine that at the time, a lot of kind of like tabloid style people want to try to get their hands on this story, and trying to approach people to take part of something would have been kind of difficult.
You're absolutely right, without a doubt. And you are either in one of two positions. You are in a position where you were either a family member, close-knit survivor, and you just happen to be a filmmaker, which I don't think there were a lot of, or you were a filmmaker who had a significant background in music video, rock music, and trying to establish the relationship. So even though I knew people, Rhode Island is a very small knit community. It's a very, blue collar, small, like many around in the world, that I think the reason why people can relate to this film so much is because this is just your ordinary town anywhere in the world. And it took a significant amount of time to develop these relationships. And, but they had to be authentic relationships, not just, I want to be your friend because I want to do a documentary. We literally became, and I still am very close to the people that you see in the film. And there was only two ways I was going to do this. One was to get the true raw emotion of these people who believed in me, who trusted in me. And the other person who you'll probably ask me about a little bit is Jack Russell, who is the lead singer of Great White, a very, very controversial documentary figure on his own. And it was a very difficult process to try to make the families understand that he was a person, that Jack Russell was a person that needed to be in this film along with them. That was the biggest challenge I had, because most people wanted no part of Jack, at least on the survivor family side. So it was a tightrope. It was like walking on a tightrope balancing act the whole time. But the answer to your question is, it is relationships, it's access, and it's trust.
You know, when Jack Russell appears in the movie at first, the note that I wrote down, because I take notes when I do reviews, etc. I wrote down, he's drowning in guilt and booze. It just seemed like that the guilt was so overwhelming for him. The excesses of his lifestyle from beforehand just like really took over him, to the point where he just seemed like he was not really kind of functioning at all as a person. Now it seems like he's really gotten his life back together. But at the time when he was like really in the throes of his addictions and his demons, how difficult was it to get him on camera to talk about this? Because while on one circumstance you had the families of the victims not being very happy with him being in the movie, what was his attitude towards it? Or was he open to talk about it? Or is it just part of his nature as an entertainer and as a public figure to want to get on the record, and especially even in regards to something as tragic as something as a station nightclub fire?
Yeah, all very good points you make. I think it's all of the above. I think when you are a front man in rock music, as you know, and many people know, you have a nature and a tendency to be in the spotlight and wanting to be in the spotlight. And when something like this happens, the irony and the emotions, the conflicting emotions of wanting to be in the spotlight and knowing that, many people consider you a murderer has to be, I can't even imagine what goes on inside of your brain and your heart. So that was one of the reasons why I was so interested in exploring him as a character, is because, as you can imagine, the inner conflict. So the answer is, I think there was part of him that absolutely wanted to get out to the public what he really felt. And I think it was the same issue I had on the family side, where Jack needed to trust somebody. The problem with Jack and a lot of folks, I think, is when they get on, they know the media, they respond to the media, they get radio interviews and television interviews and concerts, and they act like their persona, right? They act like, the Jack Russell frontman. That's not the way you act after a tragedy like this. And I think the problem is every time Jack got on camera or Jack was on the radio, he may have said things that he may have regretted because he's in the persona of Jack Russell, the frontman. So the way he communicates is probably not the best way. So I knew that the only way to do this was to treat Jack Russell as a documentary character and embed with that man. So I understood every part of him. And that's what we had to do. It took me years to get what you see on camera. That is the real Jack. And there's many sides to Jack, as you see. I don't think you can identify Jack as a linear person by any means. He's got multiple layers to him.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by 80s Tees. 80s Tees is an online retailer of licensed t-shirts and pop culture gear from your favorite movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comic books, and musicians. Celebrate your inner 80s nerd and click on the link in the show notes below to get the raddest retro t-shirts delivered to your door. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Loot Crate. Founded in 2012, Loot Crate is the worldwide leader in fan subscription boxes. Loot Crate partners with industry leaders in entertainment, gaming, sports, and pop culture to deliver monthly themed crates, produce interactive experiences in digital content, and film original video productions. No matter what you geek out about, Loot Crate has a subscription box for you. To get your very own exclusive collectibles, apparel, and gear delivered to your door, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is also brought to you by Vudu. Watch the latest movies and TV shows anytime, anywhere. No subscriptions, no contract. Enjoy stunning quality in up to 4K ultra high definition at home and download and watch on your mobile device as well. To rent and buy from over 100,000 titles or watch thousands of movies free with Vudu Movies on us, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. Now, back to the show. I wanted to talk about another person who's very much a central part of this story, and that's Joe Kinnan. And for people who don't know, so Joe was the last survivor pulled from the fire, and because of that, he suffered really kind of like horrific, severe burns to his body, but he did survive. And, you know, I just find him such a remarkable man because he went through such an ordeal, such a painful ordeal emotionally and physically. However, at the end of the day, he has such a great sense of humor about him. He's such a personable, person. He, almost kind of like, it's going to sound like a weird use of the phrase, but it's kind of like he was kind of like reborn in a certain way. Started a new family. He's just a remarkable person. I can't say enough things about him. What was your experience like with Joe? What was it like when you first met him and talked to him about the project?
Well, you're hitting on something extremely important. And when you break down these characters, Jack Russell, Joe Kinnan, and the others, there's a reason why they're in the film. And it was not by accident. It was by design of trying to understand the choices that, for instance, Jack Russell made versus the choices that Joe Kinnan made. And I'm talking about after the fire.
Yes.
So, one of our chapters in the film, as you'll notice, one of the titles is "We Are the Choices That We Make." And the way I define Joe is that Joe, by the way, when you mentioned reborn, that's very accurate because Joe has a second birthday and he actually celebrates his second birthday, and it's in May. And he was woken out of a coma, and he considers that, basically his second birthday. And
wow.
That was his choice. He did not look in a mirror. He couldn't bring himself to look in a mirror for almost 2 years. And you can kind of imagine that when you finally look at yourself, I don't know if you can imagine that, but if you think about that for a minute and, decide that, okay, today's the day I'm going to look at myself in the mirror after, which has happened, you have a choice to make. I either don't want to be on this earth anymore, which many people would take that path, or I can choose to live my life as another new person, a reborn person in some sense. And that's what he did. So just as important as Jack Russell is in the film, Joe Kinnan is certainly, if not more important, equally as important. They're all important because as a viewing audience, I think you can see the balance and not balance, I guess, so much, but just, again, the choices that we make. It was up to Joe. That was Joe's choice to live the way he's living now. And that's Jack's choice to live the way he lives,
The thing that really got me really just angry when watching the film is that this whole scenario, this whole situation really came down to a perfect storm of mistakes. Mm-hmm. It could have been unavoidable in a lot of ways. So a lot of people dropped the ball, and it's just shocking how inadequate and irresponsible the lack of checks and balances were. If one person did one thing correctly, it's a good chance that maybe this thing wouldn't have happened. When you first come across all the information in regards to what happened that night, the circumstances of it, just how shocked were you with all the information laid out in front of you? Because I'll tell you what, like I myself, when just watching it, it really infuriated me because it comes down to just a lack of professionalism and also people taking greed over safety. I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
That's absolutely right. And I guess a couple of things you can list on the paper, and that's why in the film you'll see in one of our acts, there's a long list of things that is being written down as notes, and it's everything from no fire extinguishers to inspections to overcapacity to, the list goes on. And you're absolutely right. If you pull one of those things out, pull out the fact that, hey, there was a couple of fire extinguishers sitting on the side of the stage that could have easily put out the foam quickly. Consider pulling out the overcapacity. Pull out any one of those things. The perfect storm that had to happen, and I think that's what people find intriguing is that, and they get very emotional and upset about it. When I read John's book, that's when the answer to your question is that's when it all came to me, because John did such a thorough job. The book Killer Show is goes with the documentary very well, because it gets into the detail that we certainly can't get into in an 88-minute television version of the documentary. We may do an extended product down the road, but I had to have John's book as the fundamental foundation. Not that the film was going to be based on the book, from a creative, follow the page perspective, but from a factual standpoint, to try to understand what really happened and what mistakes happened and who is to blame. So that's why the film lies on top of the foundation of the book Killer Show, which all the things you're mentioning in terms of the mistakes and the greed and the ego and all of those things are very well laid out in more detail in the book if people are interested.
Something that is remarkable about that night is the footage that came from it. This was before smartphones, so it's not like these days where people like practically watching the concert, through their phone while at an actual concert. Like, people had cameras and they had VHS tapes, etc. We are spared in many ways the horrific imagery that from that night. I mean, a lot of it is described, a lot of it is alluded to, some of it is just some brief glimpses here or there. I'm sure yourself, as the filmmaker, having to go through all the hours of footage, would have seen things that would have affected you deeply. What is that like to see these images? And to this day, are these images still something that affect you, like right down to the core of who you are as a person?
Yeah, just touching on one thing you said, which I think is really important, is this tragedy happened right before the explosion of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And that's why we couldn't spend that much time on it. But it is a really important point to make, is that we become numb to this stuff now. And then that was not the case. And you turned on your television set and you waited till 11 o'clock at night to watch the news. So that's why it becomes really important, why that footage was so important. But going to your question specifically, as far as from a filmmaker perspective, yes, it's very disturbing. I mean, parts of that video, obviously, from the Brian Butler video, was captured by a local news station. If you watch the film and read the book, there was a cameraman in the club that night. But you got to remember, the cameraman was out pretty quickly, right? Mm-hmm. So within a minute and a half, I mean, if you weren't out of that club in 90 seconds, you likely were not getting out of that club. So that shows you how quickly that news cameraman came out of that club. However, he did capture a lot of things from the outside that are pretty horrific. And but I'll tell you one thing. You mentioned images, and as filmmakers, we talk about images, and that's our toolkit. But honestly, sound was more disturbing to me. And when you're a filmmaker, a lot of people, I don't want to say forget about sound, but it sometimes can be more than 50%, 60% of the movie. We couldn't do that as much in this television version, just by the nature of the format. But I will tell you, there's a story that we had to leave out of this film that we hope to put back into a longer version. And it has to do with sound, and it has to do with some other piece of media that was uncovered that nobody has heard, and it has not been publicized. And we would never, play that tape, but you can think to yourself for a minute that, sounds can sometimes be more disturbing than images.
Yeah, I remember that movie, the Werner Herzog one, Grizzly Man. And I don't know if you ever saw that. There's a scene where they're listening to the attack of the bear attack. There was no visual, but there was image. There was a soundtrack of it, and they refused to air it on there. And I think it really goes to the point you were talking about with sound, because the imagination kind of takes over there, doesn't it, and creates its own image. Is it true? I mean, you mentioned a couple of times now the potential of an extended cut, or maybe a series in the future. Is it true that you had like 350 hours of footage that you were working with?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about for a minute, let's take Jack Russell and take, the concept of going backstage and understanding the life of a rock star today, the rise and fall of this 80s god to, some of the clubs that he plays today. If you are a fly on the wall and you're capturing hours and hours of behind the scenes footage, or if you're in the hospital with Joe Kinnan or out on the playground with him and his wife and his child, you can see how that footage can add up very, very, very quickly. Because again, this isn't about sitting down for an interview. This is about living with these people and understanding how these people live. And so 350 hours, and it sounds like a lot, but when I explain to you, it's not as much as you think. And the problem is there's about 10 different movies sitting in the archives on the cutting room floor that are equally as engaging and compelling. And as I mentioned to you, there are many things that were left out of this. So yes, currently there's a couple of things in the works to either for a director's cut, a feature length, seamless for like video on demand or streaming. Even DVD, Blu-ray, which I know is kind of a dinosaur these days, is not so much in this particular genre because a lot of the fans still buy physical product and they like to collect. So
I sure do.
That's always a possibility. Yeah. And so for bonus scenes, for additional, episodic pieces that were left out, or for extended interviews and things like that. So we have a lot of things in the works that we're trying to just weigh the pros and cons, by the end of the year.
Final question. What has the reaction been like from the people of Rhode Island, especially the people, the families of victims and such? Have they seen it? Have they got any feedback in regards to the film? I'm really curious to see whether this has helped in any way to maybe not achieve closure, but maybe have one step closer towards that.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things that haunted me every single day in the editing room is, am I making the right choices, for these people? Because that's why I'm doing this, right? And so it was a very strenuous time to try to understand, how are they going to feel? And we had a screening, a private screening in Rhode Island for the families that were in the film and the survivors. And I was overwhelmed at how happy, and I don't want to say happy in terms of happy, but the emotions that they left with, and many watch it over and over and over again. It's hard because some of them are seeing their loved ones, again, a lot of them won't even look at their own family photo albums sometimes, or they won't even look at their home movies because it's too difficult. So especially when you see them and their family members up on the screen in a story. And, in the case of Mike and Sandy, the young, beautiful couple who died together in the fire, they had just gotten married a year prior to that. And so, when you see Sandy in her wedding video and you watch her and you see her talk, it can be jarring. So, but what's really interesting to me is that we have not had one negative reaction. I mean, by far, not even average reactions, but extremely powerful, happy. Thank you for doing this. People can now understand what we live with. People will never forget my loved ones. And those are the kind of reactions we get.
So for everyone out there listening, the guest list available in the US at Reels. If you go to reels.com, that's reelz.com, you can find more information there. This is an important, documentary, David. I really do believe so. I don't know if you know, but here in Australia, we just started opening up our venues, and only a couple of days ago, one venue, a pretty popular one in Sydney called the Enmore, had a floor collapse 4 meters down in a packed house. So these things happen, even to this day. And I don't know what the circumstances behind that, but if anyone thinks it can't happen, something like this, whether it be through mistake or irresponsibility or what have you, can happen at the next gig that you go to, just make sure that everything is taken care of before you go out, and that you go to somewhere that's safe. And David Bellino, thank you so very much for joining me tonight. The guest list is just such a great documentary. You did great work here, and I just want to say thank you again for joining me.
Matt, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.